Hi, in this video I want to basically introduce the book of Romans in the New Testament and give some of the reasons why I think the book of Romans was written. Why did Paul, the Apostle Paul, write the book of Romans? Well, first of all, let me give you the bottom line. So I'll start with what I want you to basically take away from this video, and then I'll do a whole lot of background information and come back to them at the end. So first of all, I think that Paul wrote Romans because he wanted to introduce himself to the churches at Rome. He had never been to Rome, and so he felt like that's where God wanted him to go next. And so he wrote Romans as an introduction of himself to the church. Now, I think he also wanted their support, not just their spiritual support, but I think Paul also wanted their material support because he wanted to use Rome as a jumping off point for a mission into Spain. Paul was a church planter. He didn't spend a lot of time in established churches. He saw his goal as bringing the gospel to as many non-Jews as possible before Christ returned. And he had a sense of urgency to get the gospel out there. I think in the early part of his ministry, he thought the Lord could come back any day. And so you could see the urgency he would feel to get the gospel to as many people as possible. And so he hoped to use Rome as a mission base to launch a mission into Spain and to perhaps have their material support on that journey. No shame in that. It's a good cause. I think Paul also wanted to defend his side of the story. I don't think Paul had a particularly good reputation out there among Christians, believe it or not. I mean, we know that Paul, so many of Paul's writings ended up in the New Testament. We know that, evidently God thought Paul was right on most of the issues that we hear about in the New Testament. However, it wasn't entirely clear at that time that Paul was right. And so Paul has a bad reputation. You can see this in Acts 21 with the sit-down that James, the Lord's brother, has with Paul. And so Paul writes Romans, I think, to present the gospel, a defense of his version of the gospel and a defense of himself. He is not somebody, for example, who says, let's sin that grace may come. That's not Paul's gospel. He is not an encourager of sin. Let us do evil that good may come, Romans 3:8. That's not what Paul preaches. And so I think one of the reasons why we get such a systematic presentation of at least one aspect, not every aspect, but we get a systematic presentation of one dimension of Paul's gospel, is in part because he's defending himself against those who say things about him that aren't true. He's defending his side of the story. Lastly, we have some indications from the final chapters of Romans that Paul knows about disunity within the church at Rome, and so he writes to bring unity between the strong and the weak, so to speak. Now, there is an issue as to whether or not Romans 16 was directed at Rome, and I'll talk about that in a different video. Most think that Romans 16 was directed at Rome. I don't feel like I have enough information. I am strongly sympathetic to the view that Romans 16 was actually sent to Ephesus originally. We'll get to that in another video. But if Romans 16 is original, it is original. The question is whether it's written to Rome or to Ephesus. If Romans 16 was written to Rome, then Paul apparently knows quite a bit about this, the churches there, and that plays into some people's hypotheses as to Paul writing for the unity of Rome. So there's this video in a nutshell. You could stop right now and you'd have had most of what's in this video. In the rest of the video, I want to give some backstory. So the usual questions about Romans. Who, where, when, and why. The who is fairly easy. Nobody doubts that Paul wrote Romans. If Paul didn't write Romans, who was this guy? I mean, let's forget about even knowing who he is if he didn't write Romans. Paul is the author. When? Where? He wrote it from Corinth. We know this because of Romans 16:1. Again, it's not that this couldn't be argued against, but there's just no compelling reason not to accept Corinth or Cenchrea or somewhere around that area as the point of origin. In Romans 16:1, Paul commends Phoebe, the deacon of Cenchrea, and then a little bit later in Romans 16, he talks about enjoying the hospitality of Gaius, who we know was at Corinth. So I suppose it's more that verse with Gaius mentioned than it is even Phoebe. But everything about Romans 16 suggests that Paul is at Corinth when he writes, and that fits with Acts, because Paul says he's going to Jerusalem in Romans 15, and in Acts, Paul's at Corinth right before he goes back to Jerusalem. So Corinth is a generally accepted answer as to where Paul is when he writes Romans. Where's he writing it to? Rome. Nobody questions this. There's no debate over that. When? The late 50s. Again, this is generally accepted. Some say 57, some say 58. That's a fairly standard dating for the book of Romans. So there are some basic, boring historical details. Now, let me go into Paul. How did we get here? So this next part of the video has to do with the background of Paul and of his ministry, just in case you don't know much about the Apostle Paul. Paul was an ancient person. He lived 2,000 years ago. Why would I say that? I would say that because identity to ancient peoples was not formulated the way that we think of identity. We're individualists. We know a person by how they define themselves. They make their own destiny. They be who they want to be, so to speak. We are individualists today. The ancient world was a group culture. You knew things about a person by their gender. We actually push back on this today, and I think rightly so, that just because somebody is a male or a female does not in any way imply that they are definitely a certain type of person. That's just not true. Genealogy, your family back then said a lot about who you were. We don't do that as much today, although we do occasionally say, oh, he's from a good family. So we still have some tinges of that today. Geography, what a person's ethnic or geographical background. So the very word Jew comes from Judea. And so identity was linked to location to a large extent. Again, we fight back against these kinds of stereotypes today. Just because somebody is a Scythian or a Cretan doesn't necessarily mean that they're a liar or a dirty, rotten scoundrel, uncouth barbarian. Those, however, are the hallmarks of the herd mentality of a group culture. And so you could have arranged marriages in a group culture because a person's identity is largely determined by external features. You know whether they're male or female, you know what their family is, you know where their location is, and so you can kind of arrange the marriage because you know all the essential pieces of a person's identity, practically before they're born, other than the gender part. So families can say, well, hey, if you have a son and I have a daughter, or vice versa, let's have them get married. You can do that in a group culture. Again, we're not that way in the Western world, and I personally think it's much better that we're that way. However, these are important lenses to put on when we are reading the New Testament, knowing that their identifiers were more external. He's a Hellenistic Jew. Now, he doesn't define himself that way. He defines himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. In fact, I think some of the seeds that the germs that God used to make Paul what he became was the fact that I think he struggled with the fact that even though he had wanted to identify as a Hebrew of the Hebrews, he was born in Tarsus. So the point of his origin in Tarsus, and the fact that he spoke such good Greek, the fact that he was a Roman citizen, the fact that he probably was from a somewhat wealthy family, I think, these sorts of things were things that I think he was a little embarrassed about to some extent, because he wanted to be a good old Gamaliel Pharisee, a Hebrew of Hebrews. So I think that fighting against his Hellenistic origins may have played a role in what he ended up being. He's a diaspora Jew with some education, not as much as Apollos, which got him into some conflict at Corinth. But a diaspora means he's from the Jews that are scattered out among the world. Again, I think he suppressed this part of his identity. He went to Jerusalem, studied with the Pharisees, wanted to, kind of disavow his Hellenistic origins, but he was who he was, and God used it when he finally tapped him on the shoulder, when God finally tapped him on the shoulder. He was a Roman citizen. Book of Acts indicates that he was born a Roman citizen, which implies that his family had some status and some wealth. Of course, Paul doesn't ever say this, but I'll just keep going. He was a Pharisee. He calls himself a Hebrew of Hebrews in 2 Corinthians, I believe it is, and in Philippians 3. So Pharisees believed in a high standard of purity. They watched what they ate. They watched what they touched. They were very careful because they saw this as an act of faithfulness to God. Some of them became legalists, but not all of them were legalists. Some of them were just very strict, I assume. The whole question of legalism is more of a Christian worry than a Jewish preoccupation, I think, as Jacob Neusner, I believe, has said from time to time. So Paul was a Pharisee. N.T. Wright suggests that the Pharisees may have had a political dimension to their purity, that they wanted to keep the law to such a high standard in hope that God would come and restore Israel as a nation. That would imply, that if somebody, therefore, in Israel was not following the purity rules, that made them a liability to the future of Israel. They would explain some of the wrath that Pharisees had. Pharisees, I think, probably took the Maccabees as their models of zeal for the law. For example, read 2 Maccabees. It's in the Roman Catholic Old Testament. Well, there's a little background of Paul there. When he received the call from Jesus, Jesus appeared to him personally after the resurrection. Paul came to understand his calling as an apostle to the Gentiles. Even though Acts makes a point of saying that Paul goes to the synagogues first, that is not something that Paul emphasizes at all. Paul does not see himself primarily as an apostle to the Jews. He sees himself primarily as an apostle to non-Jews. In 1 Corinthians 15, he indicates that he was the final witness to the resurrected Lord. So there aren't any more apostles like Paul. There are those who talk about apostolic ministry today, but believe me, there is no apostolic ministry today like Paul, because there's nobody I know who calls themselves an apostle today who's actually seen the risen Lord in the same way that Paul and the other apostles did. Again, he's called to be an apostle to non-Jews. He's a church planter, as I said. He doesn't see himself as someone who works in established churches, but as somebody who plants new churches. Tent maker by trade, leather worker. He used this as we talk about tent making ministries where you have a secular job, as it were, in order to open up a door for you to do evangelistic type of things. Paul probably used his tent making in the marketplaces of cities as an opportunity to meet new people and to spread the gospel. He does say something interesting. I think it's in 1 Corinthians 4. Gives you the impression that he lowered himself to work with his hands, which again gives me the impression that back home his parents probably more own the company than are just simple leather workers. Paul's ministry started before he believed in Jesus. He started as someone who worked for the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, and the high priest, apparently. As a Pharisee, he ran missions for them, persecuted Christians, arrested people. But once he became a Christian, the cross became the center of his preaching. We know this from things he says in 1 Corinthians 1 and Galatians 6 and such. Although, interestingly, the cross is not the center of his letters. We have to remember that his letters fill in gaps that need to be filled because he's not present. He prefers to be present. His letters are a substitute for his preferred presence. And so we're not getting in his letters the core necessarily. We're getting in his letters the things that he needs to say after he's left. That's a sobering thought, that the very center of what Paul preached might not actually be in his letters. I think the cross was the center of Paul's preaching. After he became a Christian, he called a stir almost immediately in Arabia or Damascus. Was he preaching Christ's return? He ticked someone off, politically. He had to escape Damascus in a basket, we hear. He spent perhaps a decade after that maybe from 36 to 46, maybe something like that, he spent back in his home country in Tarsus. And then he emerged as a missionary from Antioch of Syria around, 40, let's say 46. Paul becomes a missionary. So after his first missionary journey with Barnabas, his first missionary journey was perhaps 46 to 48. He gets back to Antioch, and there's a bit of a series of crises that take place. Paul has especially, I know that Acts gives Peter credit, but some of, and I'm not in any way denying Acts 10, but I think Luke, the author of Acts, really wanted to highlight order and to emphasize the order of the mission to the Gentiles. I think that Acts plays up Peter's role in bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. But I think that is an important statement that Acts makes. But in terms of on the ground, I do not think that people would have associated Peter with the mission to the Gentiles. I really don't think that the average believer in the late 40s would have associated Peter with a mission to the Gentiles at all. I think that they would have associated Paul as this controversial figure who had started focusing on bringing the gospel to Gentiles, and that would have been highly controversial. The Jerusalem Council does come to the conclusion that Gentiles don't have to be circumcised in order to be saved. But I believe that James and Peter and some others believed that it was very important for Jews not to make themselves unclean in their interaction with these Gentile believers. So I think we find the seeds of justification by faith in a conflict that happened at Antioch after Paul's first missionary journey. Paul knew that the Gentiles were in. He knew that Jews and Gentiles should have table fellowship. And then this conflict at Antioch sealed the deal. What happened was Peter came and visited Antioch, and at first everybody's eating together. You have Jew and Gentile believer, they're all eating together. And then some people come from headquarters, from James, who basically are concerned, okay, Gentiles can be saved, but Jews still have to keep these purity laws. And so Peter, I think that Peter probably doesn't care much, but he does what he thinks is right, and he withdraws from eating with Gentiles under the pressure from James. And so he withdraws himself, and so you end up with Barnabas basically goes along with it, I think probably to keep the peace, and Paul stands up in front of the church pretty much and calls Peter a hypocrite. You haven't ever kept the law, Peter. I've kept the law. You don't even know what it means to keep the law, Peter. This is ridiculous. We get right with God on the basis of faith, not on the basis of these works of law like purity rules on who you eat with or whether or not you're circumcised. None of that ever makes us right with God. It's purely our faith in Jesus Christ that establishes a right standing before God. And so this incident at Antioch, I think, seals the deal for Paul, that our standing with God is not based on works of law, and here he especially has in mind those aspects of the Jewish law that distinguish Jew from Gentile: circumcision, purity laws, food laws, Sabbath observance. That's especially what Paul has in mind, I think, when he talks about works of law, especially in Galatians. But that we get right with God on the basis of the faith of Christ. I think that's probably a double entendre, because it can mean either the faithfulness of Jesus, his faithfulness unto death, or our faith in Jesus. And I suspect that Paul means it both ways, that he starts with the faithfulness of Jesus as a common ground between him and Peter, and then moves to establish the general principle that it's faith in Christ that gets us right with God. Okay, that's all background to Romans. The result of this conflict of Antioch is that Paul and Barnabas part ways. Then Paul, God uses it for good. Paul picks up Silas and Timothy, and they go to Greece. Who knows how long it would have been until they would have gone to Greece if this conflict hadn't happened. Paul conducts journeys throughout Asia and journeys throughout Greece with Silas and Timothy. He spends 2 years at Corinth. He spends 3 years at Ephesus. He probably spent some short stints in prison, I think at least, that aren't mentioned in Acts. Acts can't mention everything. I think there may have been a very serious imprisonment or jailing at Ephesus where Paul may have written Philippians. It's not entirely clear. Whether that's the Acts doesn't tell us about that, but I think there are reasons to think so. So here is a map. I have letters instead of locations, but you can see that F down at the bottom, down here at the bottom, F is Jerusalem, and then Antioch is G up here. H is Tarsus, where Paul is from. E is the island of Cyprus, where he goes on his first missionary journey. I is Ephesus, where he spends 3 years on his third missionary journey. Up at the top here, we have Philippi and Thessalonica on his second missionary journey. L is Athens, and then M is Corinth, where Paul writes Romans, and N is Rome, to which he writes Romans. A is Italy, B is Greece, and C is Asia Minor. So Paul is at M, Corinth, when he writes to Rome at N. He writes right before he goes to F, Jerusalem, and there he's arrested. So Paul writes Romans from Corinth, around 57, 58. He says there's no more room for him to minister in the East. Again, I've mentioned Romans 16, that question of whether it was originally for Rome or for Ephesus. How does he know so many? Here's some of the reasons why some think that Romans 16 might have been written to Ephesus originally, although, again, this is not the majority opinion right now. The consensus is that Romans 16 was for Rome. But how does Paul know so many people in Rome, if that's the case? Priscilla and Aquila, they were in Ephesus last time we knew, and in 2 Timothy they're in Ephesus. So did they go from Ephesus to Rome and back to Ephesus again? It's, of course, possible. He addresses, most of the people he addresses in Romans 16 are people associated with Asia, including the first convert of Asia. So those are some reasons why some think that Romans 16 might have originally been written to Ephesus. So who were these Roman Christians to whom he was writing? Well, first of all, the Roman church was perhaps a church that was founded organically by travelers. It was not founded by Peter, which is Roman Catholic tradition, although Peter did eventually make it to Rome and died in Rome. And I think it's fair to say that the Church of Rome probably had a Jerusalem-style approach rather than a Pauline one, because, again, it was not founded by Paul, and Paul is somewhat unique among the early Christians. So Rome would therefore have had a more conservative approach to the law than Paul's churches did. We know that in AD 49, the Roman Emperor Claudius expelled Christian Jews from Rome because of their debates over Christ. I mean, there is some debate over this, but Suetonius mentions Claudius kicking the Jews out of Rome because of debates over Christus. That would suggest that the church at Rome was primarily Gentile in base, at least for a few years. And so we've made an argument here that the Church of Rome was probably a somewhat theologically conservative, that is more Jewish, although Jewish, more continuity with Judaism, that is, and primarily a Gentile church, remembering that Judaism and Christianity were not separate religions at this point. All of the early Christians would have seen themselves as a Jewish religion of sorts. So there's evidence from Romans, I think, to support what we've just said. 1:3, in 1:13, Paul says that he hopes to have fruit among them as among other Gentiles, which suggests that the church is primarily Gentile. Notice that he does not divide up the world, him being a debtor to both Jew and Greek. That's not what he says. He says he's a debtor to Greeks and barbarians, meaning that he's divided up the Gentile world rather than dividing up the Jewish and Gentile world. He's dealing with intra-Gentile categories, in other words, as if he's writing to Gentiles. 10:1, he speaks of the Israelites as something different from the people that he's writing. My prayer is that they may be saved, implying again that the Romans are not Israelites primarily. I'm not saying there are no Jews in the church at Rome. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that I don't think the church at Rome was primarily Gentile. 11:13, I'm talking to you Gentiles because I'm an apostle to the Gentiles. So Paul is not writing to all Christians at Rome. He's writing primarily to Gentile Christians at Rome because Paul is an apostle to the Gentiles. So we come back to where we started. What is the situation of Romans? Paul is about to head west to Spain. He wants to use Rome as a launching point for that missions, and so Paul is introducing himself, as we said in an earlier video. Paul has a bad reputation, as we see from comments he makes in Romans, and also what we see in Acts 21. So in that sense, Romans is a defense of Paul's vision of the gospel. And so in the meantime, Paul is also addressing some issues facing the Roman churches. So the situation of Romans, what is it? Paul is introducing himself, hoping to use the Roman church for material support. He is defending his understanding of the gospel, and he is also trying to urge unity for the Church of Rome. So there you have it, an introduction to Romans and the reasons for Romans and some background to Paul's ministry.